Welcome everyone back to another episode in Introduction to Python with PyData Sri Lanka. And what we're going to be discussing today is going to be on Python functions. So let's get into it. So before we head on to the coding part, let's try to understand what exactly a Python function is. So the general definition of a Python function is it's a block of code which is organized and which is reusable and is used to perform a specific task. Now this is a little difficult to understand if you're hearing it for the first time. But let me break it down in a way that you understand it through an example. So in any car or any vehicle, we have a braking system. So a braking system is similar to a Python function. Let me tell you why. So a braking system has several components that is part of it. And each of these components is well organized. You have the brake pedal, you have the brake lining, then you have the brake discs, the master cylinder, and all sort of things. And what we need to understand is when you press down on the brake, then there is some sort of a function that happens, and then eventually the car ultimately stops or slows down. Now, this means that this particular system is well organized. And on top of that, we can also reuse it as much as we want unless there is a problem or a fault in the braking system. So you can press down on the brake at any point in time to slow down the car or to stop the car. And this particular braking or whatever the function that you're doing is done to perform a specific task, which is to slow down the car or to um, stop the car. So a Python function is similar to that braking system. It's a well organized block of code which is reusable and is used to perform a specific task. So if you have some sort of code, a code block that is repeated over and over again, then it is better to write it or define it inside a Python function because you don't need to repeat that block of code within your script. You can basically define the function and call that function within that particular script. So that's going to make the code much more concise and readable. So now let's try to understand how exactly do we define a function and what are the different types of function that exist in Python. So there are a few types of functions that exist in Python. First is the inbuilt functions. These are functions that usually comes with Python when you install it. Then you have the user-defined functions. These are functions that we define based on our own requirements. And then you have the anonymous functions. These are like disposable tools that are utilized to undertake small instructions. So let's go over them one by one so that we understand how they work. Okay. So the first one is the built-in functions. So the built-in functions are, as I told, are functions that comes with Python, and they are there when you start using Python. So for an example, print, min, round, all of these are built-in functions. So if I run this, you'll see that it's going to print the minimum of this particular list, the minimum value within this particular list. And this particular built-in function is going to round up this initial value to three decimal places. So this is what inbuilt function does. So you have a lot of inbuilt functions within Python, which you can explore. And the most important thing is when you are defining your own function, do not try to override these inbuilt functions. In the sense, try to avoid naming the user defined function or the function that you are writing with the same name as that of something that is already there in Python. Okay. So let's now go into user-defined functions. So as I mentioned earlier, user-defined functions are used to define a function that is tailored for our own requirements. So we create this particular function. So there are several things that we need to sort of cover when it comes to defining our own function. The first thing is we need to know how to tell Python, look, we are going to be defining a function. And for that purpose, there is this keyword called def, which will basically state to Python, look, I'm going to now define a function. Then once you add that keyword, then you need to follow it up with a space, and then you have to mention a name for your function. So if you take this particular example, you would see that initially I have told Python, look, I'm going to be defining a function, and then I'm going to follow it up with a name for my function. And then I'm going to add two parentheses, and within these two parentheses you can add arguments or parameters. So sometimes we define functions with no parameters or arguments, and sometimes we add arguments. So if you're going to be adding arguments, you need to add it within these parentheses. Then you're going to add two double dots or a colon, and then in the next slide you need to make sure that you have a tab. You keep a tab, and then you can specify the code block that needs to be executed. So in this case, I'm just going to be returning, hey everyone. Okay, so this is how you define a very simple user defined function within Python. And this does not have any parameters. So if I run this, there's nothing that's going to come out. I mean, there's no return value. Now we need to execute it or call it. So how you call it is you're going to say return underscore value, which is going to be the name of the Python function. And in order for us to execute, to tell Python, okay, I'm going to be executing this, I'm going to add these two parentheses. So this is going to tell Python, look, I want to call this function as well as to execute it. So when I run this, it will give me the return value, which was hey, everyone. You can also assign the return value to a specific variable like this. So here what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking the return underscore value, and I'm going to add the two parentheses to ask it to execute it, and I'm going to store the return value into this particular variable called func value. And if you run this, you will see that once you run the func value variable, it has been and that particular variable contains the return value from this particular function. Okay. Next is another interesting thing to understand. So imagine now you want to assign this particular function to another variable name. Okay. So if we add these two parentheses, it's going to tell Python, okay, execute it and then store the return value to this particular variable. But if you don't add this, okay, what is going to happen is it's going to assign this function's functionality to this particular variable, and then you can use the variable name plus, if you add the two parentheses, it will execute similar to this particular function. So you're basically assigning this function's functionality to this variable, which will make this a function or a representative of this function, and you can execute it as a function as well. So if you run it, you see that first it has been assigned, and then you can execute it similar to a function. Okay, so that was all about functions without parameters. Now let's try to add parameters or arguments. So let's say for an example, I want to define a function where there is two parameters that goes in, and we are going to subtract the two values that is sent through. So here, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to take value 2 and I'm going to subtract it from value 1. I'm sorry, going to take value 1 and subtract it from value 2. And then I'm going to store it into this particular variable called value 3. And then I'm going to return that particular value 3. So if I was to execute it, I'll have to send these two parameters or these two arguments, right? So if I run this, the answer that I'm supposed to get is -3. And if I run this, you will see that we got those two we got that particular value. Now let's try to investigate what exactly happens if we do not pass any arguments. So if you don't pass any arguments to this particular function, once you run it, it will throw an error saying is not sorry, this subtract. Let's try to get this Here, if I run this, it will say that it is within two required positional arguments, which is value 1 and value 2. Okay, so you need to make, if you are adding parameters, you need to make sure when you're calling that function, you add the two parameters. You need to define those two parameters. Okay, so let's also look at another example. Here we are going to be add value and we are going to double it. So we are going to initially take the two values, we are going to add it, and then we are going to double it, and then we are going to return it. So in this case, if we add these two, that's going to be 9, and if we double it, we are going to get 18. So the results here should be 18, and as you can see, we got 18. So let's look at another simple example. Let's say that I want to create a function where I want to uh, randomly send out compliments to a specific person. And since it's a tiring day, it's very difficult for me to search the internet and then send out a random compliment every day. So what I do is I'm going to create a function with a set of with a list of compliments, and I'm going to call this random, which is an inbuilt library. um, and I'm going to select randomly a complement here, and I'm going to return it. So this so what I'm going to now call, I'm going to call this function generate complement, and I'm going to assign the return value to this complement, and I'm going to run this. So when I run this, you see that a random complement has been selected. You are the best at being you. If I run this again, I get a new a complement that is thrown. So you can add a complement to this particular list every time that you go to the internet, and then every morning you can just have to run this complement, and then it will pop out or throw a complement for you to use. So let's also try to look at another example where we have these parameters as well. So this is going to basically describe, this function is going to basically describe an animal based on its name, type, and age. Okay, so we have defined them, and we are going to be using this f string, which is basically a string where we are attaching the name, the animal type, and the age. And we are going to say this is the particular name, and this is the age, and this is the animal type. So I'm going to define I'm going to define this function, or I'm going to name it as describe pet, and I'm going to call it, and I'm going to assign the name as Rocco, and the animal type as dog, and the age as 5. And when I run this, you see this is Rocco, a 5-year-old dog. Okay, so that's a very simple examples, two examples to be more exact, on how functions can be used. Right. So let's get into a little bit more detail on Python parameters, functions parameters. So there are three types of parameters: required parameters, keyword parameters, and then default parameters. So if you want to set a default parameter, which means a parameter where there is a default value. So if that particular parameter is not mentioned, then Python will use the default value. So if you were to set a default value, then what you need to do is, when you're describing this or when you're defining this particular function, within these arguments, you have to put an equal sign and then define the default parameter or default value. So this particular parameter or argument has a default value which is 10. So in case someone forgets to attach the age, then it will use this default value. Now these ones does not have any default values, which means these ones are what we call as required parameters. Okay, so let's try to investigate. So here, as you can see, I have set this default value, and if I was to call this particular function, and if I forget to add this age parameter or define a value for age parameter, Python will automatically pick up the default value and it will execute. So here it says this is Buddy, a 10-year-old dog. So because we have set it as the default value as 10. If you set it as 9, you will see this is Buddy, a 9-year-old dog. If I want to override it, let's say I'm going to say, no, I want to override. I want to make sure that the age is set as 11. So here I'm going to set it as 11. And if I run this, it will override the default value because the age is defined here. And it's going to say this is Buddy, a 11-year-old dog. Okay. Let's now try to see what happens if we forget. Now, in this case, we know for a fact that age is a default has a default value, but these two are required parameters. Let's see what happens if we forget to mention a required parameter. So as you can see, it says that it's missing a required positional argument, which is name. So Python is very descriptive about its error. It's specifically stating, you look in your particular function that you define, there are two required parameters. One is name and the other one is animal type. You have actually missed out on one of the required positional arguments, which is name. Okay. So let's say now if I run this, you see that it has automatically executed. But what you need to make sure is, now this is where we have defined the correct order of each of these variables or each of these parameters, not variables, these parameters, right? So here is where we are specifying those particular parameters with the keyword. So this is the name of that particular argument or that parameter, and then we are going to be space. You don't need to always do that. You can, if you can maintain the correct order, then of course you can just define it like this without the keyword. But if by any chance you mess up that order, Python doesn't know what that order is. Python is just going to pick the first argument that is being passed as the first parameter, and because of it you will get this sort of an output. This is dog, a 2-year-old Buddy, because you messed up the ordering. So if there is a lot of arguments, best to sort of and it's if it's very difficult for you to keep in mind exactly where each of these arguments positions are, use the keyword, and then you can even if you change the order, since the keyword is there, Python will automatically pick up that particular argument based on the keyword. Okay, so keep that in mind. Another thing that I want to go over is a couple of best practices when it comes to defining a user-defined function in Python. The first thing is, make sure you add a proper name to your function. Similar to a variable, try to make sure that the function name describes the exact functionality of that particular function. Second thing is, try to avoid names that are similar to built-in functions, because you will then override the functionality of built-in functions. Third thing is, try to add docstrings to describe exactly what the function is doing and what those variable types are. And if you can, you should also go to the extent of adding type annotations to your functions, which is something that we will cover in future episodes. But now let's try to learn how to add a docstring. So every function that I described here, defined here, uh, adds this particular docstring. So this is what we call a docstring. So you need to add this docstring by the use of these three inverted commas. And within this, you will initially define. I mean, there are several conventions of as of how you can add this. This is the pepage structure, but there are other structures that you can follow. But in the pepage structure, the first thing is you need to describe exactly what this function is doing. Just give a description of it. Then you have to name the parameters and give the type of those parameters. Give a definition of what those parameters are representing. Then you have to state the return value, the type of it, and a small description of what that particular return value is going to be. You can also go to an extent of adding an example like this of how to execute this particular function. Okay, so if you look at it, I mean, let's say that I want to look at an inbuilt functions docstring. What you need to do is you will have to say print. Let's say I'm trying to look into the docstring of min inbuilt function, which we talked about at the very beginning. What you need to do is you have to say print and then min dot, and then you have to use this dunder method called underscore underscore code doc underscore underscore, and when you run this, it will give you the entire doc string of that particular in-wave function. So if I was to look at the doc of the doc of the user-defined function that I stated, describe pet, you can do the same thing and it will print everything that I have written here. Okay. Similarly, I added a doc string for generic complement as well, and this is basically that particular doc string. So that's how you get a doc string, as well as how you have that's how you get a doc string that is already been defined within a function. The final part of this episode is going to be on anonymous functions or Lambda functions. So, Lambda functions are like quick disposable tools that you create to execute a simple task within Python. Okay, so let's try to understand how to define one. So, let's say that I want to create a function where I want to take a particular variable or particular value, and then I want to double it. So, I'm going to define it as mult x2, or I'm going to state the name of that function as mult x2, and then I'm going to equal it to the lambda function, where I'm going to use this keyword called lambda to tell Python, okay, this is going to be an anonymous function. Then after the lambda, you're going to follow it up with the arguments or the parameters that's going to go into this particular function. So in this case, it's going to be just x. And then you're going to follow it up with a colon, and then you're going to say exactly what you need to return when it comes to once this particular lambda function is executed. So here I want to return 2 into x, which is going to be doubling the value that you get. Okay, so this is going to be the argument, and then you're going to be stating the return value. So if you run this, you see that it has returned 4 because it took one argument, which is going to be x, and you're going to multiply it by 2. Similarly, you can pass 2 arguments as well, or as many arguments as you want. So here we are going to be passing 2 arguments, and what we are going to be doing is we're going to be subtracting these 2 values. So if you run this, you see that that has been executed. You can do, you can do a lot of operations after this. Here what I'm trying to do is I'm going to be defining this function, which is going to be taking 2 arguments, and I'm going to add 2 together and then add this to the multiplication of those 2 as well. So then if I run this, you see that I got this answer 17. This is another example. This is to calculate the present value, and we are taking in 3 arguments here, and then we're going to undertake a specific operations, which is what is going to be returned. And if you run this, you will get that particular return value. Now, when should we use this is a question that might be coming into your mind. If you have a function that can be written in, the operation that happens within the function, if it can be written within a single line, then go for a lambda function. But if it is going to take several steps, and if there is several parts to it, then it's very difficult to use a lambda function for that particular purpose. So always think of it as a quick disposable tool that you create to immediately undertake a small functionality within your code. Okay, right. So we talked about functions today. In Python, we talked about built-in functions, we talked about user-defined functions, and then we also talked about anonymous functions. Do join in to other episodes as well, which will give you a glimpse of what Python is, and hope you enjoyed it, and let's meet on the next episode. Thank you.